For Vivian, the morning began, as always, quietly and steadily. There was complete silence in her house, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock in the kitchen. The woman's gaze swept over the familiar surrounding shelves with books, one of which was open on the coffee table, a blanket on the sofa that she had knitted 20 years ago, and an old armchair by the window where she liked to sit with a cup of tea. All this was a symbol of her quiet life. But the silence hid the loneliness that had been soaking into the walls for years. Her only companion during these long years was memories of the days when the house was noisy, when her younger brother David ran through these rooms, laughed, loudly read aloud his favorite comics. Vivian sighed. She was 65, and her life seemed complete. All the main decisions had already been made. Dreams had been shelved. She had the opportunity to leave, to start all over again, but it didn't seem real. She was startled when she heard a knock on the door. It was early for visits, and who could possibly come without warning? When she opened the door, she saw in front of her a man whom she would have recognized from 1,000.
David? Her voice trembled.
Her younger brother stood on the threshold, tall, stately, in a stylish coat, and with a bouquet of bright gerberas in his hands. He looked as if he had just left a business meeting. Neat hairstyle, good shoes, a beaming smile. But something in his eyes was different. Deep inside, Vivian noticed the tiredness he was trying to hide, as always.
"Hi, Viv." David smiled broadly and handed her the bouquet. "Guess who decided to please his older sister?"
What are you doing here? She stared at him, unable to believe that he was standing in front of her. You're supposed to be in Los Angeles. You had an important project.
"Come on, did you really think that I wouldn't find time for you?" He stepped inside, surveying the familiar surroundings. "It's just like when I was a kid. The same comfort, the same old books. Only you're a little more." He pretended to be considering the word ... sophisticated.
Sophisticated? I'd rather say old, she snorted, taking the bouquet from him.
After putting the flowers in the vase, she couldn't help but smile.
Sit down. I'll make tea.
"With pleasure. But promise not to forget that I love it with milk."
Yes, I remember, Mr. Picky.
David laughed. He sat down in her old armchair, crossed his legs and looked around the living room. Everything here was painfully familiar to him, as if he had returned to the house where his best years had passed. Although it had been more than 10 years since he had left here, he suddenly felt that he had not left anywhere. When Vivian returned with 2 cups of tea, she saw her brother looking thoughtfully at her favorite Langston Hughes volume. He picked it up and flipped through the pages.
"Are you still reading it?"
Of course, she replied, sitting down opposite him. Hughes's poems remind me of the times when I believed I could change the world.
"You also cheated, Viv. If it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be who I am now."
She lowered her eyes, trying to hide her emotions. Those words from David meant more to her than he could have imagined. She had always assumed that her sacrifices for him were self-evident, that he hadn't even noticed them.
You've always been strong, David. You could have done it without me?
"That's not true, and you know it. You were my rock. You've always protected me, even when the whole world was against us."
She remembered the times when she had to work 3 jobs to feed them both. How she gave up all pleasure so that he could go to college. How she was always there when he fell. She was proud of what he had become, but there was always a shadow of regret inside that she had missed her own life.
So how is your life in Los Angeles?
"Work, work, and work again," he replied, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes it seems that I no longer live, but just exist."
You've always liked to be busy. This is your element.
"Maybe. But sometimes you want to get back to what's really important." He paused, as if gathering his courage. "You know, Viv, I've been wanting to tell you for a long time."
She looked at him with interest. His gaze became softer, almost childish.
You are more than a sister to me. You are my beacon, my family, my support. I know I'll never be able to give you back everything you've done for me, but I want to try.
She didn't know what to say. Something ached in her chest, as if she'd heard something she hadn't dared to wait for.
You don't owe me anything, David. I did everything I could because I loved you.
"I know. But now it's my turn to take care of you."
Vivian felt her eyes fill with tears, but she quickly turned away so that he wouldn't notice.
Then start by staying for lunch.
"Whatever you say, Captain. Just promise not to add too much cinnamon."
They both laughed, and in that laugh was everything their past, their present, and what was yet to come. The days flowed like raindrops on a window pane, slowly but inexorably, with a soft sound, as if fate decided to mockingly remind that life continues to move forward. After David's sudden return, his presence became permanent. At first he stayed only for dinner, then stayed for another day, and soon turned Vivian's guest room into his temporary residence. He explained this by saying that he wanted to take a break from the hustle and bustle of the city and gain strength. But Vivian noticed that there was something deeper behind his smile. Her younger brother, who had always been so confident, now looked vulnerable. David, in turn, gradually got into the rhythm of her life. He saw her wake up early in the morning to water the plants on the porch, or sit down with a cup of coffee and a book in an armchair by the window. He noticed how carefully she put the groceries on the shelves, how carefully she chose her words when talking to the neighbors. Vivian was precise in her actions, but there was an inner tiredness in her movements that she never showed. One evening, a few days after his arrival, they were sitting on the veranda. A light wind was blowing outside, making the leaves whisper something of their own. There were cups of tea and a plate of biscuits on the table in front of them. David watched the sunset, and Vivian, habitually preoccupied with her own thoughts, was silent.
Have you ever regretted staying here? His voice was low, as if he wasn't sure if he should ask the question.
Do I regret it? Do you mean this house or my whole life?
Probably both.
Vivian was silent for a moment, considering his words. She knew what to say, but she wanted to be honest.
Sometimes. When you were little, it seemed to me that I had a purpose. I knew that I was doing this for you, that you would become someone great, that you would live up to my hopes, and you did it. She looked at him and smiled a little. But now that you're an adult, sometimes it feels like I've lost myself.
David felt something pinch in his chest. These words were both truth and pain that he hadn't expected to hear.
Viv, you know you've given me everything I have. If it wasn't for you.
You could have done it. You've always been smart and stubborn. I was just helping, guiding.
You have done more than you directed. You sacrificed everything so that I could become who I am. But you never thought about yourself.
David, I was thinking about myself. It's just that my wishes turned out to be not so important.
Her gaze returned to the street, where the evening sky was gradually darkening. She knew she couldn't bring back the years when she could live for herself. But deep down, she didn't want her sacrifices to go to waste.
And now that you have time, what do you want to do?
I want peace, David. Just peace.
He felt a strange sense of guilt. He knew that his sister deserved more than just a quiet life in a small house. Her sacrifices allowed him to succeed, but at what cost? The next day, David decided to distract her from her routine. He suggested going for a walk around the city, visiting the old places they once loved. Vivian, though not immediately, agreed. They walked through streets that reminded Vivian of her youth. The old cafe on the corner, where she had once met with friends, was still standing in the same place. The small bookstore where she worked after school was still inviting customers. But it all seemed far away, as if it was from another person's life.
You used to love coming here. Do you remember how I got lost in this store once, and you almost killed the owner for not noticing how I slipped out?
Of course. You've always been so restless. He could have run anywhere if you hadn't been stopped.
They went into a cafe and ordered coffee. David stared intently at his sister, who was looking at the menu as if she had never seen it before.
Do you remember that you always took tea and cake here?
You remember well, but now I want to try something new.
These words made David think. Maybe there really wasn't enough new in her life. When they returned home, Vivian looked more relaxed than usual. The walk brought back memories in her, but also gave her the feeling that she still had time and opportunities for change. In the evening, sitting on the veranda, they talked again.
Have you ever thought about leaving here?
Sometimes. But where to? This house is all I have.
You have me, Vivi. You can always count on me.
Thank you, David. but you can't be my life. You have your own.
Maybe we could do something together? Start something new together?
Those words stung her. She didn't know what David meant, but deep down she wanted to believe that her life wasn't over yet. It's been a few weeks since David arrived at Vivian's house. Their life together was peaceful, almost like in the old days when they were younger, but something began to change in this quiet routine. They spent more and more time together, and their conversations became deeper, more frank, going beyond the usual fraternal-sisterly communication. Vivian began to notice that David was looking at her differently. It was not like the usual look of a grateful younger brother, which he had been looking at her with for many years. It was a long, searching look, and sometimes it seemed confused, as if he didn't know what he was doing. Vivian ignored it, telling herself that it was all just a figment of her imagination. But one evening, everything changed. It was Friday. They were having dinner in the kitchen, discussing their memories of the past. David told the story of how, as a child, he accidentally ruined her favorite dress by staining it with paint, and how she screamed at him all day.
You were so angry then that I thought you'd never talk to me again.
Well, it was my only decent dress. We didn't have the money to buy a new one then.
And then I just wanted you to pay attention to me.
You've always been the center of my attention. Didn't you know that?
I understand that now. But then, I just wanted you to forget about all your worries for a minute and look at me.
Her heart fluttered. These words sounded too sincere, too deep, to be just part of a joking conversation. She felt something strange rising inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. After dinner, David suggested going outside and getting some fresh air. They were sitting on the porch, watching the night sky.
Have you ever thought about how our lives would have turned out if everything had been different?
In a different way. What do you mean?
Well, if Mom hadn't died, if you hadn't taken responsibility for me, maybe you would have had a different life.
Everyone has their own destiny, David. I don't think it's worth regretting the past.
I'm not sorry. I just think sometimes, maybe we could be closer.
These words came out of the blue. Vivian frowned, but decided to ignore it.
We're already close, David. You are everything to me.
I know, but sometimes I feel like it's not enough.
The silence covered them like a blanket. Vivian felt that David wanted to say something else, but she was afraid to hear it. The next day, he suggested that they go for a walk to the lake, which they often visited as children. The road there was strewn with trees, which now shone with the gold of autumn leaves. They walked slowly, talking about small things. But the tension between them still remained. When they reached the lake, David stopped and looked at the water.
It's always been so beautiful here. This place reminds me of you.
Why about me?
Because you have always been a peaceful haven for me. Even when there was chaos around, I knew I could come to you.
She felt the warmth in his words, but that warmth was too personal.
David, I will always be by your side. You're my brother.
I know, but sometimes I feel it, that I want something more.
Her heart began to beat faster. She looked at him, but he avoided her gaze.
David, do you know what you're saying?
I know, and I'm ashamed of it, but I can't ignore how I feel.
The words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. She looked away, trying to collect her thoughts.
David, we can't. This is wrong.
Why? Because that's what people say. Because society has decided what is possible and what is not.
No, because that's what I say. You're my brother. That will never change.
He paused, realizing that he had crossed the line. They stood by the lake for a few more minutes, but now there was a gap between them that neither of them could bridge. When they returned home, Vivian went to her room, trying not to show tears. She knew she had to talk to him, but she didn't know what to say. Her feelings were too complicated. This night was a turning point. They both knew that their relationship would never be the same again. After that evening at the lake, the atmosphere in Vivian's house changed. There was a tension between her and David that was almost palpable. Every look they gave, every word they said to each other, seemed to carry more meaning than they were willing to admit. Vivian tried to get back to her usual life, but nothing was familiar anymore. She understood that her feelings, which she had suppressed for so long, were now awakened and could not be ignored. For David, the situation was even more difficult. It seemed to him that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that a step forward could destroy everything that he and Vivian had built. But he didn't want to back down. His thoughts were focused on one thing: how to convince Vivian that what they were feeling didn't need to be hidden. Their closest friends and neighbors were the first to feel the changes. People who are used to Vivian's ordinary life have noticed that now she looks confused, thoughtful, and often avoids meetings. The rumors were not long in coming. Their walks together, long hours in the house with each other, the absence of the usual visits from neighbors, all this became an occasion for conversation. On the street, at the store, someone made a remark. "Did you hear that she sheltered her brother? And it's just the two of them all the time. It's kind of weird." These words gradually grew like weeds in the small community. People began to look at Vivian with suspicion. Even those who had always treated her with respect now tried to keep their distance. She noticed it: cold glances, evasive answers, whispers behind her back. It was a real challenge for David. He was not used to being judged, especially for something he considered sincere and real. He began to avoid communicating with his neighbors and going out to the store so as not to face their condemning silence. But one day this silent conflict turned into an open attack. One of the neighbors, Mr. Williams, stopped Vivian on the porch of her house. "You probably don't understand, but people started talking. Maybe you should be a little more careful." Vivian stared at him with a stony face, but inside she was seething. She knew what he meant. She knew what people were saying. But what was she supposed to do? David, who was standing nearby, heard this conversation and approached them. "If you have any questions, Mr. Williams, ask them directly to me." The man hesitated, muttered something about undesirable situations and left, leaving them alone. Vivian couldn't sleep after that incident. She felt the tension growing, as the society she had always trusted now looked at her as a stranger. But the most painful thing was that she couldn't decide what to do about it. David saw how it affected her. He became even more determined in his intention to protect their bond. It seemed unfair to him that people who didn't even know their real history allowed themselves to be judged. He started talking about moving out, to go far away from these people who will never understand, who will not be able to look deeper than superficial judgments. But Vivian didn't want to run. "If we leave, it will mean that they have won," she said one day. David was impressed by her words. He knew she was a strong woman, but even her strength had a limit. He saw her sitting at the window at night, staring at the dark sky, as if looking for answers there. Meanwhile, the rumors continued to spread. One of Vivian's old friends, Miss Grace, who had always been close to her, stopped coming in for tea. When Vivian met her at the store and tried to talk to her, Grace only nodded briefly and left, saying she was in a hurry. This betrayal of friends was the last straw for Vivian. She realized that their lives would never be the same again. They have become outcasts in a society that they once considered their home. But what to do next? Vivian was painfully searching for an answer. She felt that her life had split into two parts: the one that had been before, and the one that began after that evening at the lake. David, seeing her pain, decided that he could no longer stay in the shadows. He offered to talk openly with those who condemned them. It was a risky move, but he believed that only honesty could save them from complete isolation. They started with the closest ones. David and Vivian invited some old friends to dinner. It was awkward. There was silence at the table, which was sometimes interrupted by strained phrases about the weather and the news. But at some point David couldn't stand it. "I know what you're all thinking," he said. "You're judging us for something you don't understand." These words caused a shock. Some of the guests tried to get away from the topic, but David insisted. He told them that he and Vivian were closer than many siblings, that they always supported each other. Yes, we are different. Yes, our relationship is not like everyone else's. But does that make us bad? These words made some people think, but not all of them. Someone left without saying a word. It was a painful evening for Vivian, but she was grateful to David for his courage. She realized that he was willing to do anything to protect their bond, even if it meant losing everyone else. After that dinner, it became clear that their way forward would be difficult. But despite all the condemnation, they felt that honesty was the only way out. And although they knew that the world would not accept them, they decided not to hide. Vivian no longer wanted to live shy of her feelings, and David was ready to defend her to the end. After that night, when some of their friends turned away from them, Vivian realized that her life would never be the same again. She felt that she was at a crossroads, as if a huge invisible pointer was telling her two ways: one to a familiar, safe world where she could once again become just an older sister, and the other to the unknown, which scared her to shivers. But it was impossible to stay in place. The society that was once her mainstay has now become her judge. For years she had earned respect with her hard work and kindness, but now, after the rumors, people began to avoid her. Even the church she went to every Sunday was no longer a place where she felt safe. The pastor once mentioned sinful ways in his sermon, without naming names, but it was clear who he was talking about. Vivian sat in her usual pew, feeling like she was being watched. That day was the last time she crossed the threshold of the church. The house that had always been her refuge now seemed like a cage. Every rustle outside the window, every sound of footsteps made her uneasy. Sometimes she found herself closing the curtains so that no one could look inside. This paranoia became her constant companion, depriving her of sleep and rest. David, on the other hand, was determined. He saw Vivian in agony and felt he had to be the one to support her. However, his presence, while comforting, also intensified her inner conflict. Every time he entered the room, her heart was squeezed by conflicting emotions. He was everything to her: a brother, a friend, the only person who understood her like no one else. But these feelings, so warm and sincere, began to cross the line. Vivian often sat alone on the veranda, in silence, trying to make sense of what was happening. Her life has always been built around principles correct and clear. She sacrificed her dreams for the sake of her family, becoming David's mother and mentor. She never regretted her decisions, believing that she was doing everything right. But now she felt that her inner compass was broken. Her thoughts kept returning to their conversation by the lake. Then she tried to close herself off from David, from his feelings, from the very possibility that they could be more than brother and sister. But these words, spoken by him with such sincerity, continued to ring in her head, causing tears and confusion. The rumors continued to spread, and like a snowball, they became bigger and more absurd. People who didn't even know Vivian personally were discussing her. This was the last straw. She couldn't ignore the pressure anymore. Neighbors, acquaintances, even random people in the store began to avert their eyes or cast reproachful glances at her. Her world was falling apart, and she felt completely alone. David saw how she was suffering and suggested a solution to leave. He insisted that a new city where no one knows their history would give them a chance to start from scratch. But Vivian couldn't just give up everything she had known and built her whole life. This house was a part of her soul, and this city was the place where she was born and grew up. One night, when she couldn't sleep, Vivian sat by her bedroom window for a long time. She looked at the stars, which seemed to her as far away as her own happiness. Her mind wandered, returning to the moments when she first began to notice that her feelings for David went beyond the ordinary. It was so subtle, so gradual, that she didn't even realize what was happening. His smile, his kindness, his ability to understand her without words, all this became a source of comfort for her. But now that same consolation has become her biggest curse. She wondered what would happen if she gave in to her feelings. What price will she have to pay? Their relationship has already been the subject of discussion, but what happens if they admit their feelings to each other? Her life will be ruined completely, her name will be tarnished forever. She could lose not only the respect of others, but also herself. And yet there was a spark inside her that wouldn't let her rest. A spark of desire to finally live for yourself and not for others. She always did the right thing, always followed the rules. But these rules did not bring her happiness. Maybe it's time to break them? Over the next few days, Vivian tried to distract herself, but it was useless. She thought about David every minute. His laughter, his voice, his touch, it was all too real to ignore. She knew she had to make a choice, either step back and close this chapter of her life forever, or risk everything for the opportunity to be happy. One evening, when David was sitting in the kitchen, she decided. She entered the room, feeling her heart pounding. She wanted to talk to him, to tell him everything that had accumulated in her soul. But when she saw his look, she realized that words were not needed. He already knew everything. It's been a few months since David left. For Vivian, this time was filled with emptiness and pain, which she tried to hide even from herself. Her house, which had always been a source of peace for her, now seemed empty and lifeless. His absence filled every corner with a silence that haunted her. She was trying to get her life back to its usual routine. Every morning began with the usual things: gardening, reading books, going to the store. But all this was just an attempt to distract myself. Her thoughts kept returning to David. She blamed herself for not being able to handle the situation, for allowing society and her own fears to destroy what was between them. The neighbors continued to shun her. Even simple meetings with local residents, which previously seemed harmless, have now turned into unpleasant clashes. She noticed whispers behind her back, evasive glances, and sometimes outright contempt. These moments made her wonder if she had done the right thing by pushing David away in order to meet the expectations of others. But the hardest part was coping with loneliness. Vivian was used to being a strong, independent woman, but now, without David by her side, she felt lost. Every day she found something that reminded her of him: a cup with his favorite drawing, his books that were left on the shelf, or a blanket that he once threw on a chair when he was reading by the window. Meanwhile, David was also restless. After leaving Vivian's house, he went to a nearby town where he rented a small apartment. But the work he was trying to immerse himself in did not help to drown out his feelings. Every day he remembered their last conversation, her look full of love and fear at the same time. He felt like he had betrayed her by leaving her alone. He couldn't accept the thought that their bond had been broken. Everything inside him screamed that he had to come back, that he had to be by her side no matter what. But he was afraid that she would push him away again, that her fears and doubts would be stronger. It took several months before he decided to return. For David, it wasn't just a decision, it was a step into the unknown. He knew he could face her rejection, her fears, but he couldn't take the separation anymore. When he arrived in his hometown, everything seemed the same as he remembered. The road to Vivian's house, the old trees, her beloved garden, everything looked unchanged. But emotions were raging inside him. He was afraid of how she would meet him. Vivian noticed him from the window. She was sitting in her chair when she saw him get out of the car. Her heart began to beat faster, and for a moment she froze, not knowing what to do. It was unexpected, but at the same time inevitable. She knew that this moment would come sooner or later. David went to the door and knocked. Vivian opened the door and their eyes met. At that moment, there was not just silence between them, it was the weight of their shared past, all those words that had not been said. His return was a moment of truth for Vivian. She realized that she could no longer hide her feelings, that she was tired of fighting with herself. She saw that he had not come to condemn or reproach her, but because he could not live without her. They talked for a long time. Vivian shared her fears, her pain, her guilt for what she feels. David, for his part, was as outspoken as ever. He said that their connection was the most important thing for him, that he was ready to fight for them, despite the condemnation of others. These conversations helped them both realize that they could no longer deny their feelings. Their bond was too deep to be ignored. But at the same time, they realized that their decision to be together would bring them even more difficulties. They decided to take their time. They understood that the world would not accept them, that they would face condemnation and rejection. But they also knew that they had each other, and that was the most important thing. For Vivian, it was like the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She felt that she no longer wanted to live by the rules that society dictated. She was tired of pretending that her feelings were wrong. She realized that being honest with herself is more important than the opinions of others. David, in turn, was willing to do anything to protect her and their relationship. He felt that their path would be difficult, but he was willing to go through it with her. This new chapter was full of suspense, but they both felt they had made the right choice. Their decision to be together, despite everything that was against them, was the beginning of their struggle for the right to be happy. Vivian and David made the decision to be together despite the severity of the condemnation and internal doubts, but their path to living together turned out to be more difficult than they could have imagined. The decision to openly admit their feelings required courage from them, which they had not even suspected before. Vivian, who had spent her entire life trying to follow rules and moral standards, suddenly found herself on the opposite side of public opinion. What used to be her pride, the respect of her neighbors, the status of a wise and kind woman, has now become a cause of pain for her. Her name was remembered in conversations with contempt. People who had once asked her for advice or help now avoided her house. The hardest part was accepting the fact that her choice had violated all the usual boundaries. Her inner voice kept reminding her that she was violating the unspoken law of family and society. But at the same time, a sense of liberation grew in her. Now she wasn't pretending, she wasn't hiding behind masks. She lived as she saw fit, and this feeling, despite all the difficulties, brought her a strange calm. For David, this struggle was difficult in its own way. He had always felt confident and independent, but now his confidence was being seriously tested. He could no longer ignore the scornful looks and open attacks. But the hardest thing for him was seeing how it affected Vivian. Her strength, which he respected so much, seemed to be eroding day after day. Their first attempt to go out together ended in failure. They went to the local park where they used to walk, not thinking about the fact that someone might be looking at them. But now their gazes were filled with condemnation. They felt like they had become outcasts in their own city. One of the neighbors approached them and bluntly stated that their behavior was a disgrace to the entire community. It was a blow that Vivian barely endured. They didn't talk much on the way home. The silence was loud and tense. David felt guilty for dragging Vivian into this situation, but at the same time he was firmly convinced that their feelings were worth all the difficulties. At home, they decided to develop a strategy to deal with the attacks. They started by limiting their public appearances. Their home became a refuge for them, a place where they could be themselves without fear and condemnation. They set strict boundaries, avoiding meetings with people who could hurt them. But this seclusion also had its consequences. Vivian, accustomed to being part of the community, began to feel increasingly isolated. Her memories of a time when she was respected and appreciated began to haunt her. She couldn't get rid of the thought that she had lost something important, and this loss depressed her. David, seeing her condition, offered to leave. It was a logical step for him to leave everything that hurts behind and start a new life where no one knows their history. But it was not an easy decision for Vivian. This city was her home, a part of her being. She couldn't just drop everything that was related to her past. However, thinking about it, she realized that this city no longer gives her the support she once received. Her past, though dear to her, now became a chain that prevented her from moving forward. She began to see David's offer not as an escape, but as a chance for a new life. Before making a final decision, Vivian decided to meet with a few old friends. She wanted to check if she still had connections that could support her, but this attempt only confirmed her fears. People who had previously admired her wisdom and strength could no longer hide their condemnation. Their cold words and evasive glances were the last confirmation for her that she no longer belonged here. After that, she agreed to David's proposal. They started planning the move. This process turned out to be difficult. They had to decide where to go, what to take with them, and how to start a new life. Vivian felt mixed emotions: fear of the unknown, sadness at parting from home, and the hope that their love would be able to withstand this test. They chose a small town where no one knew them. There they could start with a clean slate, without judgmental glances and rumors. The move became a symbol of a new beginning for them. Vivian knew that this step would change her life forever, but she was willing to take the risk. When they finally left their hometown, Vivian felt a strange sense of relief. She knew that she was moving away not only from condemnation, but also from a past that was no longer a part of her. Now her life was focused on what she considered the most important thing: her sincere feelings and honesty to herself. Their fight was far from over. Even in a new place, they had to overcome many obstacles, adapt to a new life, find a job, make friends. But the most important thing is to keep your love, despite all the difficulties. For Vivian, this move was a lesson. She realized that you can't live by adjusting to other people's expectations. Her choice to be with David was risky, but he gave her a freedom she had never felt before. Now, being away from the past, they could finally start building their future. And although their path was difficult, they knew that this was their path, and they were ready to walk it together. The move marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives for Vivian and David. They left their hometown in the early morning, when the streets were still empty, as if trying to avoid a parting glance at places that were now associated with pain and condemnation. The car was loaded with their few belongings: several boxes of Vivian's books, David's clothes, a couple of family photos, and a few items that reminded them of the warmth of their home. Everything else was left behind, as was their past. The journey to the new city was long and exhausting, but at the same time it was permeated with a sense of hope. Every mile, every stop at a gas station or at a roadside cafe reminded them that they were finally leaving behind tenacious stares and condemnation. Now their world will be the way they create it. Their new home was in a quiet area on the outskirts of a small town. It was a small but cozy house with a white fence and a garden overgrown with flowers. It wasn't as spacious and well-maintained as Vivian's house, but there was something new about the place, almost refreshing. It was a house that they had to fill with meaning and warmth. From the first day, they began to equip their new space. Vivian took care of the garden, which immediately became her favorite place. She found solace in this activity, as if every rose or lavender bush she planted reminded her that life could be started from scratch. David, in turn, took over the job of repairing the house. He fixed creaking floors, repainted walls, and even built bookshelves for Vivian's books. Their joint work on the house became something of a ritual that brought them even closer together. However, not everything went smoothly. Despite the physical distance from the past, memories and fears did not let them go. Vivian often woke up at night, remembering the words of neighbors or the faces of people who turned away from her. She was afraid that their new life might face the same problems as the old one. Her anxiety increased when she noticed how David's gaze lingered on her, with the same feeling that had once made her doubt the correctness of their relationship. David, on the contrary, tried to be strong, not to show his feelings. He understood that their path would not be easy, but he believed that together they could overcome any difficulties. Every day he reminded himself that their bond was more than just love. This was their truth, which they could not deny. Gradually, they began to establish relations with their new neighbors. People in the city turned out to be less curious and more friendly. The neighbor across the street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harper, often brought them pastries and invited them to tea. Vivian found comfort in her companionship, which she missed so much. Mrs. Harper seemed to see something in Vivian that others hadn't noticed: her strength and warmth. David soon found a job at an architectural firm. He had to start small, but he was glad to do what he loved again. His workaholism became a way for him to distract himself from negative thoughts, and he was happy to tell Vivian about his projects. She, in turn, began spending more time at the library, where she signed up as a volunteer. Her love of books and literature helped her feel useful. However, even in this new, seemingly safe life, their feelings remained under the scrutiny of others. Not everyone was ready to accept their closeness, which went beyond the standard understanding. Some neighbors asked questions about why they lived together and why their relationship seemed so unusual. These moments reminded them that public opinion is a shadow that cannot be completely erased. Vivian wondered more and more if they had done the right thing. She was tormented by doubts, but every time she looked at David, she felt a certainty that she could not explain. He became not only a support for her, but also a symbol of her strength. She saw in him everything worth fighting for. One evening they were sitting together on the porch of their new house, watching the sunset. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with meaning. It was the moment when Vivian realized that despite all the difficulties, they had made the right choice. They could not live for the sake of others, forgetting about themselves. Their happiness did not depend on the opinions of others, but was based on their own honesty and love. Over time, they began to feel more confident. Their home turned into a place where they could be free without fear of condemnation. Their garden blossomed, the walls of the house became warm and cozy, and the books on the shelves witnessed their new life. It was not just a physical transformation, but also a spiritual one. They no longer felt like runaways or outcasts. Now they were just people who had chosen their path. Their new life was far from ideal. They still faced condemnation, sometimes even in the most unexpected places. But they learned to be stronger. They learned to close the doors of their house from the eyes of others and open them to those who sincerely wanted to understand them. For Vivian, this path has become an important lesson. She realized that happiness cannot be found if you look back all the time or try to meet other people's expectations. Her life with David wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was the most important thing for her. Vivian woke up at dawn. The smell of rain from last night hung in the air. She was in the mood to do some cleaning, especially in the attic, which had long served as a warehouse for old things. It seemed that for many years she had never really looked there, leaving the past locked under lock and key. Pulling her hair back into a ponytail and throwing on an old flannel shirt, she climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. A small window let in scant light, illuminating a pile of boxes, an antique chest, and a yellowed carpet. Dust hung in the air, but to Vivian, the smell was familiar, almost comforting. She began to sort through the boxes, finding old albums, postcards, David's children's toys, and her old school books. A small wooden chest in the corner caught her attention. It was locked, and there was a key on a darkened chain on top. She didn't remember ever seeing him before. When she opened the trunk, there were neatly folded letters, tied with ribbon, and a small stack of photographs inside. Vivian's heart beat faster when she saw her mother's handwriting on the envelopes. She sat down on the floor, holding the first envelope in her hands. Its date was written more than 40 years ago. She read the first lines and her breath caught in her throat. "Dear Emma, sometimes I feel like I've made a terrible mistake, but I can't afford to think otherwise. The secret about David should remain just between us." Vivian froze. She turned the letter over, ran her eyes over the lines, not believing her eyes. In the following paragraphs, the mother wrote about a man named Robert, who was like salvation, but became the cause of all the troubles. She mentioned that Robert left town when he found out about her pregnancy. Those words echoed in Vivian's head. She put down the letter and picked up the next note with trembling hands. In each new letter, her mother revealed more and more details of what she was hiding. David was the son of another man, not her father. He was born out of love, but that love was not destined to last. She looked at the photos. One of them showed her mother with a strange man. He had dark hair, high cheekbones, and a smile that Vivian would have recognized from 1,000. It was David's smile. A rustle on the stairs interrupted her thoughts. It was David. He went upstairs when he saw her sitting on the floor with letters in her hands.
"Are you okay, Viv?" He stopped, looking at her anxiously.
"I found something." Her voice trembled.
David sat down next to her, picking up one of the letters. He ran his eyes over the lines and then looked at Vivian.
"Are these letters from Mom?"
"Yes, And they're about you, David. About your past.
My past? He frowned. What do you mean?
She took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts.
David, you are not our father's son.
His eyes widened and then narrowed in disbelief.
What? Is this some kind of joke?
No, I found the letters. Mom wrote about a man named Robert. She said he was your father.
He was silent for a long time, looking at the photo.
But that doesn't change anything, does it?
Of course it does. She could feel the panic in her voice. Everything we knew was not true.
Viv, listen to me. I didn't know about it, but it doesn't change who I was to you.
But it changes us, David. We thought we were brother and sister. We built our lives on this basis.
And it shouldn't ruin anything. Yes, it's a shock, but that doesn't negate everything we have.
Her eyes filled with tears. She wanted to believe him, but this new knowledge seemed too destructive.
I do not know what to think now.
Then think like this. I'm still the same person who has always been there for me. And you are everything to me.
He hugged her, and she felt her tension ease a little, but there was still a shadow of doubt inside. This mystery of the past became for them both a test and an opportunity to start all over again. Now they understood that their bond was not limited to blood ties. It was something more, that they had to determine for themselves. Vivian couldn't calm down for a long time after reading her mother's letters. The mystery of David's real father threw her into confusion, but also awakened something more, a desire to understand and find out the truth to the end. She couldn't let these letters remain just a memory hidden in the dust of an old chest. She felt that there was something else hidden behind her mother's words and decided to figure it out. Among the letters, she found one addressed to a woman named Emma with the caption, "Forever your friend Lillian." In the letter, the mother talked about her difficult life after the breakup with Robert, about how hard it was for her to raise David alone. But the last line caught Vivian's attention. "If David ever finds out the truth, let him understand that I did everything to protect him. Emma, I know you understand this better than anyone else." Vivian knew who Emma was. She was her mother's best friend in her youth. The last time she saw Emma was at her mother's funeral many years ago. Then Emma seemed to her a wise but restrained woman who always knew how to say what was really needed. Vivian decided to find her to understand what her mother was talking about. The next day, she told David about her plan. He supported her, although he was visibly worried. His concern was expressed, not in words, but in the way he avoided meeting her gaze, as if he was afraid that the truth they would learn would change their lives even more. After several hours of searching through old address books and calling the city administration, Vivian managed to find Emma's phone number. She lived in a nearby town, just an hour away. They agreed to meet on neutral territory, in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emma was the same woman Vivian remembered, slightly bent, with piercing eyes that seemed too smart for her age. When Vivian and David entered the cafe, Emma rose from her seat, her lips curved in a restrained smile.
"Vivian, I haven't seen you in a while." Her voice was low but firm.
"Emma, thank you for agreeing to meet. It is very important." Emma shifted her gaze to David, narrowing her eyes.
"And you should be David."
"Yes, I'm glad to meet you." Emma nodded and pointed to the chairs opposite her. When everyone was seated, she looked at Vivian carefully.
"I know why you are here. Lillian has always been afraid that this day would come."
Vivian felt something tighten in her chest.
Did you know about Robert?
Emma nodded, then looked at David. "I knew Robert better than you can imagine."
Then tell me, who is he? Why did he leave us?
"It's not that simple, David. You have to understand that your mother was trying to protect you. Robert wasn't a bad person, but he wasn't ready to be a father. He was confusing."
Confusing? What does it mean?
Emma sighed and folded her hands on the table.
Robert was a man who was looking for himself. He dreamed of freedom, of a life that was not bound by obligations. When Lillian got pregnant, he was scared. He had feelings for her, but he just didn't know how to be the man she deserved.
And he just left?
Yes, Eva said softly. But later he tried to come back.
These words made Vivian wary.
Come back.
Lillian never told you about it, but a few years after you were born, Robert tried to contact her. He wanted to get to know you, David, but Lillian decided it would be best for both of you.
Why?
She was afraid that he would disappear again, that he would break your heart the same way he broke hers.
Emma's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. David nodded slowly, but Vivian noticed that he was struggling to contain his emotions.
Emma, do you think he's still alive?
Emma hesitated, then nodded.
I think so. He's been living in Chicago for the last few years. I've heard that he sometimes asks about Lillian.
Does he know about me?
Yes, and I think he'd like to see you if you're ready.
These words stunned Vivian. She had always believed that their past was a closed chapter, but now, with this new knowledge, everything seemed much more complicated.
Emma, are you sure he's changed?
People change, Vivian. Sometimes years and regrets can make a person better.
The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Vivian and David felt depressed. They thanked Emma and left the cafe. It was a warm autumn outside, but the air felt cold. Vivian and David walked in silence, each lost in his own thoughts.
Do you think we should find him?
I don't know. It's your decision, David.
And if he disappears again?
Then at least you'll know who he is.
David nodded, but his face remained tense. Vivian felt that this path would not be easy for him, but at the same time, she understood that this was the only way to close this chapter of their lives. Life in the new city was gradually improving. Vivian and David sought to settle into their new reality, which was far from the condemnation and tension they had left behind. Their house has turned into a cozy place, filled with books, photos, and memories of better days. They tried to keep their distance from the locals, enjoying relative anonymity, but like any secret, their story could not remain hidden forever. At first glance, the new community looked calm and friendly. People greeted them with smiles, and neighbors even brought homemade cakes as a sign of good neighborly relations. But small towns are known for their close connectivity. Soon curious glances began to linger longer than usual, and friendly conversations took on notes of excessive interest. One of these observant people turned out to be their neighbor, Mr. Carter. He looked like a friendly man in his 50s, with always disheveled hair and a slightly cynical smile. He introduced himself as a writer and journalist working for a local newspaper. Carter, as it turned out, had a nose for unusual stories, and his attention was drawn to the way Vivian and David held on to each other. Their solitary lifestyle and unwillingness to actively communicate with others aroused his suspicions. One day, Carter came to their house under the pretext of collecting material for an article about the new residents of the city. He suggested writing an article about Vivian and David's new stage of life, portraying himself as a friendly and interested neighbor. Vivian was wary, but David, wanting to show that they had no reason to keep secrets, agreed. The interview went smoothly. Carter asked the standard questions: where they came from, what they were doing, how they liked the new city. However, something about his questions made Vivian feel uncomfortable. He emphasized their relationship, asking overly personal questions about why they decided to move in together and why they didn't have other family members supporting them. These questions made her tense up, but David tried to keep a low profile, answering in such a way as not to arouse suspicion. A few days later, Carton reappeared, this time without warning. He asked even more direct questions, which Vivian tried to ignore. She began to realize that his interest was not so much friendly as professionally curious. His behavior reminded her of a shark smelling blood. She asked him to leave, but at that moment, Carton quietly said that he knew something about them. It was the beginning of the end of their quiet life in a new place. Carter started an investigation. He found old recordings from their past town, where rumors about Vivian and David had become a local legend. Fragments of this information became the basis for the article he planned to publish. Carter wasn't looking for a sensation out of spite, but as a journalist he felt it was his duty to uncover an unusual story, even if it might harm its participants. A few days later, Vivian and David received the news. Their neighbor was going to publish an article in the local newspaper. The headline of the article promised a scandal. The unusual connection of new residents. What are they hiding? This news hit them like a bolt from the blue. Their attempts to live a quiet life collapsed. Vivian was crushed. She was worried that their new life, their chance for a peaceful future, would be ruined again because of someone else's curiosity. Her anxiety increased to such an extent that she could hardly speak, just sat by the window and stared into the void. David, on the other hand, was determined. He knew Carter wasn't acting out of malice, but that didn't lessen the threat. David decided to meet with Carter to try to stop the publication. He knew that honesty was his only weapon. At the meeting, he told Carter the whole truth, about how their bond had strengthened over the years, how they had overcome difficulties together, how the condemnation of society had forced them to leave. He did not try to justify himself, but asked Carter to reconsider her plans. David said that the publication would not only harm their lives, but would also be a reminder of the injustice they had already endured. Carter, after listening to him, visibly softened. He hadn't expected such frankness. For him, it was a lesson that behind a curious story, there are real people with real suffering. He proposed a compromise. He would rewrite the article so that it would not reveal their identities or cause damage, but at the same time raise the topic of condemnation and bias in society. For Vivian and David, it was a partial success. They managed to avoid the full disclosure of their secret, but they realized that even in a new city, their connection remains under threat. This situation forced them to reconsider their behavior. They decided that they would no longer try to hide. Instead, they will live the way they want, and let those who condemn them do it openly. This experience showed them that the struggle for their happiness is inevitable. Their love was tested by another blow, but it withstood, and with it their confidence in the correctness of the chosen path grew. After the incident with Mr. Carter, the tranquility that Vivian and David had been striving for in the new city was under threat. Even though the article in the local newspaper was reworked and did not reveal all the details of their relationship, its general tone made the residents of the city think. The article subtly hinted at the strangeness of their relationship, and although the names were not mentioned, many guessed that they were talking about new residents. At first, Vivian and David tried to ignore the sidelong glances and the changed behavior of the neighbors. However, over time, it has become increasingly difficult to ignore. They could feel their surroundings changing. People who used to smile affably now avoided them. At the grocery store, cashiers would start discussing them right after they walked out the door. In the neighborhood community, where they used to look for reasons to talk, there was now a tense silence when someone mentioned their names. It was especially hard for Vivian. She has always been a person who aspired to harmony with others. She used to be able to find common ground with almost everyone, but now she felt like a stranger even where she wanted. Start all over again. Every day was a challenge for her. Her inner voice wouldn't stop. They're judging you. They will never accept you. These thoughts became a heavy burden that was impossible to get rid of. David, on the contrary, tried to deal with the situation more decisively. He knew that such changes were inevitable and believed that they just needed to wait it out. People will get used to it, he often said when he noticed Vivian's anxiety. However, despite his confidence, he felt the pressure himself. While working at a local architectural firm, he began to notice that his colleagues avoided unnecessary communication with him. Projects that had previously been assigned to him suddenly began to be transferred to other employees. One day, at a meeting, his supervisor made an awkward hint, which David took as a reproach. All this undermined his confidence. The climax occurred one Saturday afternoon when Vivian and David decided to go on a city holiday. This annual festival was the main event in the life of a small town. He gathered all the residents, offering food, music, and entertainment for the children. For Vivian, it was a chance to prove to herself and others that she could still be a part of the community. She prepared carefully. She chose her best dress, made a cake for the fair, and set herself up in a positive way. But from the very beginning, everything went wrong. When they arrived at the square where most of the townspeople had already gathered, their appearance immediately attracted attention. People did not hide their curiosity and condemnation. The whispers grew louder until they became loud whispers. Some frowned, some even turned away. Vivian tried to keep calm, but her smile began to fade. David squeezed her hand, but even that couldn't completely calm her down. They tried to occupy themselves with small things. They tasted food, watched a performance by a local ensemble, but everything around them seemed to scream that they were not welcome here. The culmination was that one of the old-timers of the city, Mr. Thompson, could not restrain himself and said loudly, "I don't think people with such a reputation should be here." These words sounded like a bolt from the blue. Vivian felt her face flush with shame. David was about to answer, but Vivian stopped him with a look. They left the party in silence, feeling dozens of condemning eyes on them. This case was a turning point. Vivian and David realized that they could no longer just wait for people to change their minds. They needed to do something to regain their place in society, otherwise their lives would turn into a constant flight. But what exactly? They discussed it for a long time, sitting in their living room, where their cozy home seemed to be the only safe place. Vivian offered to talk to St. Victoria's directly, to try to explain her point of view to them. David, on the contrary, believed that it was necessary to act decisively and openly declare his position in front of everyone. The decision came in the form of an open letter, which they decided to publish in a local newspaper. This letter was honest, sincere, and brave. In it, Vivian and David talked about their past, about how they became not just a family for each other, but real partners who support each other in the most difficult situations. They wrote that their love should not be the object of condemnation, and that they, like everyone else, had the right to happiness. The publication caused a storm of emotions. Some residents found the letter of provocation, others took it with sympathy. Discussions began on the streets, which gradually turned into disputes. A debate was organized in the city library, where people could express their opinions. Vivian and David decided to attend them, despite the risk. Their decision was based on one thing: if they want to be accepted, they must show their willingness to defend their truth. Dozens of citizens attended the debate. Someone said that their relationship is a personal matter, and no one has the right to interfere. Others, on the contrary, argued that such connections violate the traditional foundations of society. Vivian felt strong for the first time in a long time when she stood up to tell her story. Her voice was trembling, but her words were full of sincerity. She talked about how difficult it was to lose a family, face condemnation, and try to find yourself anew. She said that she did not demand understanding from everyone, but at least asked for respect. Her performance caused silence in the hall. Many thought about it, but there were also those who persisted. The debate did not solve the problem once and for all, but it was the first step towards the city starting to look at Vivian and David differently. It was a success for them. They did not hide, did not run away, but openly declared their truth. A few weeks passed, and life slowly began to return to normal. People began to whisper less behind their backs. Some even came up to thank them for their courage. This did not mean that everyone accepted them, but they began to feel that their struggle made sense. Vivian and David realized that society can be changed if you are sincere and not afraid to move forward despite obstacles. After stressful months, when their lives were turned upside down by the conviction in a new city, Vivian and David began to notice that the pressure, which seemed unbearable, began to ease. Their open letter, the debate in the library, and the shared determination not to back down forced many residents to rethink their attitude. But despite this, the internal tension between Vivian and David continued to grow. Their relationship had long gone beyond simple support, but what was natural for them remained unacceptable to society. Vivian became more and more lost in thought. She spent long hours in the garden, trying to find answers to the questions that haunted her. She was thinking about her life, about what it meant to be honest with herself. Her past has always been built on sacrifice, for her brother, for her family, for those who needed her help. But now, for the first time, she was faced with a choice that concerned only herself. This choice was not just difficult, it was scary, because it required her to completely reconsider all the moral foundations on which she had built her life. The situation worsened when a man from the past re-entered their lives. It was Thomas, Vivian's longtime friend, who had once been her support in her youth. They had not seen each other for more than 10 years, and his arrival was unexpected. Thomas learned about Vivian's difficulties from a casual conversation with a mutual friend and decided to come to support her. He had always been a determined man, ready to act, and his appearance in Vivian's life was another challenge. Thomas was full of energy and optimism. He saw Vivian as the girl he remembered, strong, kind, always ready to sacrifice her interests for others. He immediately noticed how her life had changed and offered her an alternative. Thomas worked for a large charity and was looking for someone who could head one of the branches. He offered Vivian this job, which included moving to another city. It was a chance for her to start over. A new life, new people, a new goal. The idea of moving seemed tempting. Vivian felt that this could be her salvation from public pressure and internal conflict. Thomas was a reminder that she could have lived differently if she hadn't stayed in the past for David. He talked about independence, about personal freedom, about the opportunity to help people while preserving himself. But behind every suggestion he made, there was a difficult question. Could she have left David? David, despite his outward calmness, felt that something was changing. He saw how Vivian spent more and more time thinking, how she became detached, how her smile disappeared. He understood that Thomas had awakened something in her that she had long suppressed, the desire to be yourself, to live for yourself. It hurt him, but he was honest enough with himself to admit that he couldn't be everything to her. For several weeks, Vivian was faced with a choice. She tried to imagine her life without David, but every time she did, she felt empty. David had become more than just a brother or a life partner for her. He was her rock, her soul, her other half. But at the same time, she couldn't deny that Thomas was right. She deserved more than to be the object of condemnation and constant struggle for the right to exist. The turning point was a letter that Vivian found in one of her old diaries. It was her own message to herself, written in her youth when she was just starting to build her dreams. In this letter, she wrote about how she wanted to change the world, help people, inspire them. She promised herself that she would never let her fears or responsibilities limit her. After reading this, Vivian realized that she had broken her promise. She realized that she was not living her own life, but the life that circumstances had forced her to choose. These reflections led her to realize that in order to make the right choice, she needed to understand what she really wanted. Thomas offered her a move and a new life, but that would mean leaving David. Staying with David meant continuing the struggle to accept their relationship, but at the same time giving up on their own development. Both paths were filled with difficulties, but both promised something she had never experienced before: freedom. In the end, Vivian decided that she could no longer live in fear of being judged. She realized that her happiness does not depend on what others think, but only on how she feels. She couldn't imagine her life without David. Despite all the difficulties, their connection was what filled her life with meaning. Thomas, with his offer of a new life, became an important reminder that she could live for herself, but her heart had already chosen. She refused Thomas's offer. It wasn't an easy decision for her, but it was an honest one. She explained to him that her place was with David, and that their love, no matter how difficult it was worth all the sacrifices. Thomas respected her choice, but his look of regret left a slight bitterness in her. Vivian returned home to tell David that she would no longer doubt. She realized that real freedom is to live according to your feelings, regardless of what the world thinks. Her choice of heart was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, where there was no longer room for doubts and fears. After Vivian finally decided to stay with David, her life took on a new direction. She no longer doubted her choice, but with confidence came the realization that their struggle was not over yet. Accepting yourself is one thing, but living openly, without hiding or feeling guilty about your feelings, is quite another. The transition from internal reconciliation to openly acknowledging her life to the world turned out to be much more difficult than she expected. Despite their efforts to mend relations with their neighbors after the library debate and their outspoken letter, condemnation and distrust remained. The people were polite but cold, which further emphasized their detachment. As Vivian and David walked down the street, they still felt other people's eyes on them, noticed how conversations suddenly stopped. Even those who tried to be friendly couldn't hide a tinge of wariness in their behavior. For Vivian, every day was a challenge. She tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that she and David could handle everything if they stuck together. But she also knew that it was impossible to live in such a state for a long time. In the silence, when they were alone, the tension became almost palpable. Vivian saw David, despite his outward firmness, becoming more and more withdrawn into himself. She knew that he felt responsible for making her life so difficult, and it broke her heart. One evening, while watching the local news, Vivian noticed that the city council was preparing for an annual public meeting where important issues for the entire city were discussed. These were usually minor problems: road conditions, park improvements, holidays. But this year, the meeting was going to discuss the relations of new residents, who allegedly undermined the moral foundations of society. It was the hidden blow that she was afraid of. Their existence has become so controversial that it has infiltrated official discussions. This news was a turning point for Vivian and David. If they had previously tried to come to terms with the condemnation of society, now they had to defend themselves openly. To leave things as they were meant to admit that they were willing to live in fear and let others define their lives. But to speak in front of everyone meant to come out of the shadows completely, once and for all, declaring that they deserved the right to be happy. Some of them would spare her life. Confession to a Killer, worse often published later, had no longer let rumors and innuendos corrode their lives. She knew that their open confession would make them even more vulnerable. However, they both knew that this was their only chance. They could no longer let rumors and innuendos corrode their lives. A few days before the meeting, Vivian and David prepared their speech. They decided to be extremely honest, to tell the whole story, about their childhood, about how they became not just a family for each other, but also the closest people. They decided to explain that their relationship does not detract from anyone's morality, that their love is just a way to be happy in a world full of cruelty and loneliness. They wanted to show that their struggle is not an attack on social norms, but only an attempt to live in harmony with themselves. When the day of the meeting came, the whole of the city administration was full. People sat shoulder to shoulder, discussing upcoming issues, but many came precisely because of Vivian and David. They knew that the couple was going to perform and wanted to hear their words. When it was their turn to speak, Vivian and David went to the microphone. There was silence in the hall. Vivian could feel her heart pounding, but when she looked at David, his gaze gave her confidence. She started talking about how hard it was for them to build their lives, how they fought for every day of happiness. She said that they are not looking for approval, but they want respect. Her voice was trembling, but every word sounded clear and sincere. David continued by explaining how the love they have for each other has helped them overcome difficulties that could have broken many. He said that their relationship is a choice made by the heart, and that no one has the right to deprive them of this choice. His voice was firm, but at the same time it sounded vulnerable to a man who had been trying for years to earn the right to happiness. Their performance evoked different emotions. Some sat in tense silence, others exchanged disapproving glances. However, there were those in the audience who listened with understanding. When they finished, there was silence for a moment, and then there was applause. They were not loud but sincere, and at that moment Vivian felt that their efforts had not been in vain. After the meeting, several people came up to them to express their support. Among them was an elderly woman who said that in her youth she faced condemnation for her life choices, and she understands how difficult it is. There were also those who just shook hands without saying a word, but their gestures said more than words. This recognition was an important step for Vivian and David. They knew that not everyone would accept them, but now they felt that they could look into people's eyes without fear. Their performance became a symbol of their strength and willingness to fight for their place in society. Life did not immediately become easier. The condemnation was still in the air, but now they knew that there were those among them who supported them. This gave them the strength to continue. Vivian no longer felt like a prisoner of public opinion. She realized that her life belongs only to her, and that her happiness is worth all the difficulties. This was not the end of their struggle, but the beginning of a new chapter, where they could be honest not only with themselves, but also with the world. And although this path was not easy, it was real, and that was what filled their lives with meaning. After that memorable speech at the city administration meeting, Vivian and David's lives began to change. Their frankness shocked the society, but did not break it. The wave of condemnation, which seemed unbearable, began to subside. People stopped avoiding them on the street, and some even approached them with warm words, apologies and thanks for their courage. Vivian noticed that even her closest neighbor, Mrs. Harper, who had previously maintained a suspicious silence, once brought a pie and said with a good-natured smile, "I don't quite understand what you're going through, but I'm glad you had the courage to tell me about it. You are stronger than I thought." These simple words became a symbol for Vivian that, despite fear and pain, the world is still capable of changing if given a chance. But their struggle did not end there. Each new day brought its own challenges. One of the most difficult challenges was the unexpected interest from the media. Mr. Carter's article, although rewritten in a neutral manner, spread across the internet and attracted the attention of several larger publications. Soon, a journalist from a metropolitan newspaper appeared on their doorstep, who offered to interview them for an article about modern couples who destroy stereotypes. Vivian was against it. She still felt vulnerable and unprepared for their story to be discussed outside their small town. But David, on the contrary, believed that this was a chance not only for them, but also for other people in a similar situation. After much discussion and doubt, they decided to agree. The interview took place in their cozy living room. The journalist turned out to be unexpectedly tactful and asked questions that concerned not so much the details of their relationship as their views on social norms, condemnation, and the right to happiness. For the first time, Vivian felt that she was being heard and not just evaluated. A week later, the article was published. It was written with respect and sympathy, but its release caused a violent reaction. Disputes broke out on social networks. Some defended Vivian and David, saying that love knows no boundaries. Others accused them of violating morality and undermining traditional values. Vivian tried not to read the comments, but the echoes of these discussions reached her anyway. To Vivian's surprise, their support was much broader than she had expected. People started writing letters to them, sharing their stories about how they fought for the right to be themselves. Some of the letters were full of gratitude for their courage, others were cries for help. One of these letters came from a woman named Linda from a neighboring state. She said that she has been hiding her feelings for her stepbrother for several years and is afraid of condemnation. Linda wrote, "Your story has given me hope. You've shown that sometimes it's worth risking everything to be happy. Thank you for being there." These letters inspired Vivian and David. They realized that their story no longer belongs only to them. She has become a symbol for those who fight for the right to love and acceptance. They decided that they would not be silent. Together with Mr. Carter, who became their ally after their performance, they organized a series of meetings at the local library. These meetings have become a platform for frank conversations about love, condemnation, and prejudice. People from their city and surrounding areas came to share their stories or just listen. Some of these meetings ended in tears, others in loud argument, but each of them brought something important: dialogue. Over time, Vivian felt that her world had become wider. She no longer lived in fear of being judged. Instead, she focused on helping others find the courage to live their truth. Her garden, which was once her quiet refuge, has now become a meeting place where people gather to discuss their feelings, dreams, and fears. David, in turn, found his place in this process. He started working on a project that helped people tell their stories through photos and videos. His works became little odes of love and honesty that resonated in the hearts of thousands of people. One summer evening, as they sat on the veranda enjoying the coolness, Vivian looked at David and felt that for the first time in a long time, her heart was full of peace. She knew that their fight wasn't over yet, but now she had confidence that they could overcome everything. Their story wasn't easy, but it was real. They proved that love is stronger than fear, and sincerity can break down walls that seemed insurmountable. Vivian realized that her happiness no longer depends on the opinions of others, but only on how she sees herself. This confidence became her new support, and she knew that no matter how difficult their future paths were, they would go through them together. Vivian and David no longer hid their love, but most importantly, they no longer hid from themselves. Vivian couldn't get rid of the feeling that the answers to many questions remained in her childhood. The house she grew up in was an hour's drive from her current home. It used to be a place full of children's laughter, the smell of Mum's pies, and the sounds of an old record that her father played on the turntable. Now this house was empty, surrounded by a garden that had long been overgrown with grass and shrubs. The place where the memories were stored turned into an abandoned box, filled with the dust of the past. The impulse to come there appeared unexpectedly. She was just going to cook dinner in the kitchen, but instead her gaze fell on an old photo on the wall. It showed her father, still young and full of energy, holding her in his arms. Her mother was standing next to her with a timid but sincere smile. It was as if this picture was calling her back to her roots, and although this decision was not easy, she understood that only there, in this house, would she be able to deal with the feelings that continued to torment her after discovering about David. In the evening, Vivian informed David that she wanted to visit the old house.
Are you sure? This place will only bring you pain, Viv.
I don't think pain is all that's left there. I can't move on until I fully figure out the past.
Oh yeah, then I'll come with you.
She hesitated, but nodded anyway. She knew that without David, it would be more difficult for her to cope with this journey. The next morning, they set off. The road to Vivian's childhood home was winding, running through a dense forest. Vivian stared out the window, noticing how the sun was breaking through the foliage, leaving patches of light on the asphalt. A feeling of anxiety was growing inside her, but she tried to keep it under control. When they arrived at the house, Vivian froze. She hadn't seen him for more than 10 years, and now he looked even more abandoned than she had imagined. The old gate creaked as David pushed it open, opening the way to an overgrown path.
Is everything all right?
Yes, it's just weird to see him like this.
They entered the house. It was quiet and dusty inside, but things remained in their places as if time had stopped here. There were books on the shelves, an old gramophone gleamed in the corner, and photographs covered with a layer of dirt hung on the walls. Vivian began to look around. Her gaze lingered on the boxes stacked in the corner of the living room. She walked over to them and started rummaging through the contents. Old letters, drawings, toys. All this reminded of childhood. Among them, she found an album with photographs that she had long considered lost. Flipping through the pages, she saw a picture of her mother with a strange man. He was wearing a leather jacket with a mysterious smile on his face. Vivian froze, studying him. He had the same features that she had seen in one of the photographs found in the attic. It was the same Robert.
Who is this?
Robert, the one my mother wrote about in her letters.
Looks like a tough guy from an old movie.
It's more than a tough guy, David. He's your father.
These words hung in the air. David just nodded, trying to suppress the emotions that began to rise in him. While continuing her search, Vivian came across her mother's old notebook. She opened it and began to read. There were notes that her mother kept in the last years of her life. Among the entries were reflections on how to save a family, and lines full of pain because the truth could destroy everything she had built. There was a mention of a man named Henry on one of the pages. Vivian didn't remember the name, but the notebook said he knows the whole truth. She looked through the rest of the records to find more information and noticed that Henry was a frequent visitor to their house when she was a child.
David, do you remember someone named Henry?
Henry? No, I can't even imagine who it is.
Mom writes that he knew the truth. I don't understand why she mentions him so often.
At that moment, footsteps sounded outside. Someone was approaching the house. Vivian froze, and David tensed, bracing himself for possible danger. The door slowly opened and a man entered the room. He was about 60, with grey hair and a tired face, but there was still the sparkle of vivacity in his eyes. He stood in the doorway, looking at Vivian and David.
I thought I'd never see this house again.
Who are you?
My name is Henry.
These words made her heart freeze. She felt David move closer, as if preparing to protect her.
Don't be afraid. I came here to talk. I knew your mother. She was a wonderful woman, and I knew that one day you would come back here.
What do you need?
It's true. She belongs to you.
Vivian and David exchanged glances before inviting Henry in. The man sat down on an old sofa and put a battered hat on his lap.
Lillian, your mother trusted me more than anyone else. I knew about Robert. I knew what had happened between them. But I never thought that her secrets could affect you so much.
Why are you here? Why didn't you tell me about this before?
Because Lillian asked me to keep quiet. She was afraid that the truth would destroy your family.
Henry began to tell the story, which Vivian listened to with bated breath. He described how Robert and Lillian met, how their love was real, but short-lived. He said that Robert wanted to return, but circumstances prevented him. With every word, Vivian felt her world turning upside down. The story she thought was complete turned out to be much deeper than she could have imagined.
Why did you come now?
Because you are ready. I can see it in your eyes. Lillian has always wanted you to know the truth, but not before you're ready to accept it.
This meeting became a new starting point for Vivian and David in their search for the truth. Now they knew that the past had not yet revealed all its secrets, and it was up to them what they would do with this truth. Meeting Henry and his story about his mother and Robert made Vivian feel even more confused. What she thought was a complete mystery suddenly turned into a tangle of new questions. Henry left as unexpectedly as he had arrived, leaving Vivian with her mother's diary and several photographs that, he said, should have helped. He said that he could no longer keep this part of the past, and now it belonged to her. Vivian couldn't sleep for several nights in a row. She reviewed the photos, reread the notes, trying to figure out what kind of person this Robert was. Why did her mother love him so much that she took the risk and kept his child, despite everything that could ruin her life? And why was Henry so sure that now was the time to find out the whole truth? David, on the contrary, tried to distract himself. For him, the truth about Robert was painful, but not as important as for Vivian. He was grateful to the family that raised him and did not feel the need to look for roots that could bring more questions than answers. However, he saw how it weighed on Vivian, and he could not leave her alone in this search. "You haven't slept all night again, have you?" I couldn't, all that, it just haunts me. Do you realize that this may not change anything? Even if you find out everything, it won't make your life easier. I know, but it's not about simplicity. It's about knowledge. I feel like my whole life is a puzzle and I'm missing the main pieces. David sighed and sat down next to her, putting his arm around her shoulders. He knew it was useless to argue, and the best thing he could do was to be there. The next day, Vivian decided to start her search from the address listed in one of her mother's records. It was a small farm on the outskirts of a nearby town, a place that, according to Henry, had once belonged to Robert's family. She insisted that David go with her, and he agreed, albeit reluctantly. When they reached the farm, they were greeted by an elderly man who looked as if his age matched the house itself. He examined them carefully before returning the greeting.
"Can I help you?"
"I'm sorry to bother you, but did you know Robert? Robert Harrison." The man frowned, studying their faces before answering. "I'm his uncle, but we haven't spoken in years. What do you want from Robert?" "We're just trying to find out more about him. This is important for us." The man invited them into the house. It was cozy inside, but there were traces of time everywhere. Old carpets, faded photographs, the smell of wood and tobacco. The man introduced himself as George and offered tea, after which he began to talk.
"Robert was a difficult guy. I've always dreamed of something more. When Lillian came into his life, I thought he had finally found what he was looking for. She was smart, kind, but it wasn't that simple between them. Robert, he was afraid of responsibility."
Why did he leave?
"It's a long story, honey, but in short, he was scared. Lillian made it clear to him that she was expecting a baby, and he decided that he couldn't handle it. I tried to convince him otherwise, but he just disappeared. A few years later, he returned saying that he wanted to fix everything, but Lillian had already made up her mind."
She didn't let him see me.
"That's right. She thought it would be better for you."
George pulled an old box out of a drawer. Inside were letters and photographs that Robert had left for Lillian, hoping she would read them. Among them was a letter addressed to "My son." David took it with trembling hands. "Are you sure I should read this?"
Yes. It might give you the answers you've been looking for.
David opened the letter. It was handwritten in a sloppy handwriting, but there was sincerity in every word. "I do not know if you will ever read this, but I need to write it. I need to tell you that I made a mistake, and I'm sorry that I wasn't there for you. I wasn't ready, but that's no excuse. I want you to know that I've always thought of you. If you're reading this, it means you've grown up. And perhaps you will understand that sometimes fear prevents us from being who we should be. I do not know if you can forgive me, but know that I have always loved you. David silently folded the letter and put it back in the box. His face was expressionless, but Vivian knew that a hurricane of emotions was raging inside him.
Did he love me?
It was a complicated man, David. But yes, he did. He just didn't know how to show it.
After this conversation, they left the farm with a box full of memories. For Vivian, it was the beginning of the end of her quest. But for David, it was just the beginning. They drove in silence in the car until David broke the silence.
You know, Viv, I thought I didn't want to know the truth, but now I'm glad you insisted.
Has it changed a lot for you?
No, not much. But now I know that my father wasn't just a ghost, he was a man who tried, even if he failed.
Vivian smiled and put her hand on his shoulder. She knew that their journey was far from over, but they had taken an important step forward, and this was the main victory. After a trip to the farm and the discovery of a new fragment from Robert's life, Vivian and David felt that their search began to take shape. However, each solved riddle raised even more questions. David gradually began to realize that his past still mattered, even though he had been trying to dismiss the idea for a long time. For Vivian, this search became not just a study of family history, but something deeper. It was her way of finding ground under her feet in the chaos that engulfed their lives. Several weeks passed, and Vivian delved into the study of Henry's photographs and notes. Among them, she found a key document, a letter that her mother wrote shortly before her death. In this letter, there was mention of a certain inheritance that Robert had left for David. There was mention of a bank in Chicago where Robert's safe deposit box was kept. Vivian felt that this was another piece of the puzzle that needed to be put together. David was initially indifferent to this discovery. It seemed to him that the inheritance was just the material side of the past, which did not matter for the present. But Vivian was convinced that it could reveal something more about the man who had influenced their family so much. She insisted that they go to Chicago to check out this lead. Reluctantly, David agreed. The trip to Chicago took several days of planning. The city seemed like a completely different world to them compared to their small town. Its noise, light, and energy were overwhelming, but at the same time empowering. Vivian felt like the heroine of a detective novel when they entered the old bank with its majestic architecture and huge columns. They went to the manager, showed the documents, and after a while they were taken to a quiet room for clients. A bank employee took out a metal box and left them alone with it. Vivian opened the box with a sinking heart, feeling on the verge of discovering something important. Inside were papers, photographs, and an old diary. It looked as if Robert had left this archive on purpose so that it would be found someday. The diary turned out to be a key element. In it, Robert described in detail his life after he left Lillian. He wrote about his feelings for her, about the regret that had plagued him for years, and about trying to find meaning in life again. He told me how he tried to contact Lillian, how he felt rejected and unnecessary. But the most important thing was that he wrote about David. Robert wanted to be a part of his life, but he understood that this was impossible without Lillian's consent. His notes were filled with pain, but also with the hope that one day, David would be able to understand him. For David, this diary was a revelation. Robert was no longer just a figure from the past for him, who brought pain to his mother. He was a man with feelings, fears, and mistakes. Reading the diary gave David a new understanding of who he was, and perhaps who he could become. Among the papers in the box was another unexpected item, a letter addressed to Vivian. In it, Robert addressed her as if he foresaw that she would be the person who would look for answers. He thanked her for always being by David's side, for her strength and determination. Robert wrote that, even without knowing her, he felt that Vivian would become for David what he himself could not be. This letter shocked Vivian. She had never thought that the person she considered the source of her family's suffering could feel such gratitude towards her. It made her think about how deeply her life was intertwined with David's. It wasn't just an accident. It was a fate that they both chose, despite its difficulties. Returning home from Chicago turned out to be more difficult than going there. David was lost in his own thoughts, and Vivian felt like she couldn't just leave it all behind. Robert's legacy gave them more than they expected, but it also presented them with a choice: to move on with this knowledge or leave it in the past. At home, they discussed for a long time what to do with the found papers. David suggested that they leave them alone and focus on their lives, but Vivian felt that they couldn't just close this chapter. Her intuition told her that all this mattered not only to them, but also to how they perceived themselves and each other. The situation became more complicated when Vivian received an unexpected offer. She was invited to work in the historical archive of a large university, where her knowledge and skills could be useful. It was an offer she had been dreaming about for years, but it required moving to another city. This meant that she would have to leave David if he didn't decide to go with her. This moment was the culmination of their internal conflict. David felt that Vivian deserved this opportunity, but he himself couldn't just leave his job, their house, and everything they had built together. Vivian, in turn, did not want to force him to choose between her and his life. They spent their evenings thinking long thoughts, discussing possible options. For Vivian, it was a choice between her dreams and their future together. For David, it's a choice between supporting Vivian and maintaining stability in their lives. Both knew that their decisions would change everything, but they couldn't predict which way. In the end, they decided that this choice should not separate them. Instead of sacrificing one for the other, they decided to seek a compromise. Vivian agreed to temporarily decline the offer in order to find a job closer to home, and David promised that in the future they would consider moving together. This situation has become a lesson for them that the past can be an important part of life, but the present is what defines their path. They realized that their connection is not determined only by common roots or memories, but is based on how they support each other here and now. It was a difficult choice, but it strengthened their resolve to move forward together despite all the difficulties. The time after returning from Chicago became a period of calm for Vivian and David, filled with reflections and attempts to integrate new discoveries into their lives. But this lull was short-lived. The mysteries of the past seemed to have found a way to manifest themselves, even as they tried to focus on the present. Soon, their personal struggle turned into an open confrontation with society, which still could not accept their connection. After the publication of the letter in the local newspaper, the debates and speeches that the city talked about for a long time, it seemed that interest in Vivian and David began to wane. But this interest was deceptive. Rumors continued to circulate, now in a more poisonous form. People began to discuss them not only in the context of their relationship, but also to connect them with recent discoveries about Robert. The rumors have become full of distortions. The story turned into gossip. Allegedly, Vivian and David are not only not brother and sister, but because of this, they are allegedly acting out a drama to attract attention. Some have gone further, claiming that they are pursuing financial gain by using Robert's story. This wave of negativity quickly took the form of hostility, which began to surround their daily lives again. The store where Vivian always bought groceries suddenly refused to accept her orders. In the office where David worked, colleagues began to avoid him, finding excuses not to share work duties with him. Even the neighbors who had initially shown support now stopped greeting or crossed to the other side of the street. The silence was louder than any utterance, and it literally hung in the air. A particularly difficult case for Vivian turned out to be when one of the mothers from the school, where she sometimes worked as a volunteer, organized a meeting of parents. There was only one word on the agenda: morality. Although Vivian was not invited to this meeting, she learned about its contents from one of her colleagues. Her parents debated whether the school should allow her to continue working with children if she was living in a relationship that many considered unnatural. This moment was not just a blow to Vivian's reputation, but also a challenge to her ability to maintain dignity in difficult times. Vivian and David understood that it was no longer possible to ignore the situation. They realized that silence would not be the solution, and trying to shut themselves off would only make the situation worse. The couple decided that the only way to move on was to speak openly, answer questions, and even, in a sense, demand respect. But they didn't know how to do it. Their first step was to attend a meeting of the local city council. At one of the meetings, changes in the rules of the local library were discussed, where Vivian had previously held a debate. Now, some residents had suggested limiting activities related to the discussion of controversial topics. It was a veiled reference to their history. Vivian and David decided to perform. There were more people at the meeting than usual. Many came just out of curiosity, but the atmosphere in the hall was tense. Vivian went to the microphone first. Her voice was trembling, but she spoke firmly. She said that the library has always been a place where people could express their thoughts and find support. She reminded everyone that freedom of speech is a fundamental right that cannot be suppressed for convenience or because of bias. She bluntly stated that their story is not a contradiction, but a human experience, and that her attempt to silence speaks not about them, but about the fears and limitations of society. David spoke next. He said that their story was an example of how people can be unfair to each other, how easy it is to condemn without understanding. He admitted that their path was not easy, but stressed that they never hid their feelings and did not try to deceive anyone. He ended his speech with the words that became the leitmotif of their performance. "We just want to live like everyone else, without fear and hatred." Their performances provoked a contradictory reaction. Some applauded, others remained cold. But the main thing was that they were heard. After the meeting, several people approached them to express their support. But there were also those who, leaving, threw malicious comments. This day was a test for their resilience, but it also reminded them that respect must be fought for. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread outside their city. The story of Vivian and David attracted the attention of a local TV channel. They received an invitation to give an interview to tell their version of events. After much thought, they agreed. For them, it was a chance to show people that they are not just the object of gossip, but real people with real feelings. The interview took place in the studio, where they were met by a friendly journalist. He asked questions not only about their past, but also about how they deal with hostility and condemnation. Vivian talked about her feelings, about how difficult it is to be the center of attention when you don't want it. David was talking about love, which is stronger than fear. Their words touched many viewers, and after the broadcast, they began to receive letters of support. Despite these small victories, the pressure from society did not abate. Offensive graffiti was painted on their house several times. Vivian was afraid for her safety, but she understood that to retreat now would be to give victory to those who wanted to break them. They decided to organize a meeting at their home for those who wanted to support them or learn more. It was an open initiative which they did not have high hopes for, but it brought unexpected results. Not only friends came to the meeting, but also strangers who expressed gratitude for their courage. Some shared their stories, admitting that their own lives were full of condemnation. These meetings became a fulcrum for Vivian and David. They began to see that their struggle was important not only for them, but also for others. Their story has become an example of how love and mutual understanding can withstand even the strongest pressure. The confrontation with society, Part 2, did not become the end of the struggle for them. It became a new stage that taught them that justice is not something that comes by itself. It must be conquered, step by step, word by word, action by action. After all the clashes with society, endless discussions about their lives and attempts to prove their case, Vivian and David realized that their struggle had gone beyond what they could control. Their story seemed to have become the property of society, and everyone found something different in it, a reason for condemnation, an example of courage, or an opportunity to discuss someone else's drama. But Behind all this external activity, there was a major problem that both of them had ignored for a long time: the internal tension between them. Pressure from society, worries about the past, and constant battles for the right to privacy began to affect their relationship. What had previously seemed solid and unshakable was now becoming a source of doubt and conflict. Both tried not to show it to each other, but inside each of them accumulated fatigue, irritation, and uncertainty. Vivian, who always sought to solve problems through action, felt depressed. She used to fight for those she loved, but now her strength began to run out. She often spent evenings in the garden, looking at the stars and wondering if they were really making the right choice by continuing to fight. Her dreams of a peaceful life now seemed like something unattainable, like a mirage that only gets further with each step. David, on the other hand, kept to himself. He has never been a person who would share his inner feelings. His method of fighting was to hide the pain and show calmness, but inside he felt crushed. His thought that he was the cause of all these difficulties for Vivian haunted him. He began to doubt whether he should continue to keep her around if it was causing her so much suffering. Despite these internal contradictions, they both continued to hold on to their bond, but each did it in their own way. This led to the fact that they began to move away from each other. Their conversations became more and more shallow, and the moments of silence became more and more tense. What used to be their strength was now turning into an invisible wall between them. The turning point was a random day that started like any other. Vivian received a letter from a woman who attended one of their meetings. The letter talked about how her story inspired this woman to confess to her family her feelings for the man she had been hiding for a long time. The woman thanked Vivian and David for giving her the courage to be herself. This letter, full of gratitude and sincerity, made Vivian think. She realized that their struggle was not in vain. What they were going through mattered not only to them, but also to other people who were looking for an example in their story. But this realization also made her look at herself and her relationship with David. She realized that in her quest to prove her case and protect her feelings, she had lost sight of the most important thing: their connection. Vivian decided it was time to stop running away from her own emotions. She knew that in order to move on, she and David had to sort each other out first. She began by going back to what used to bring them joy: walking together, discussing books, and having dinners that they cooked together. These small steps helped to relieve tension, but did not eliminate the underlying problems. David, seeing her efforts, also began to change. He began to spend more time with Vivian, trying to return to the lightness that had once been between them. However, he still felt guilty that their life had turned into a constant struggle. His inner conflict prevented him from opening up. Gradually, they began to talk more. At first, they were short conversations about small things, but over time, the conversations became deeper. They discussed their fears, their mistakes, and their hopes. It was painful but necessary conversations that helped them both realize that they still needed each other, despite all the difficulties. One of the most important points in this reconciliation process was the decision to temporarily distance oneself from external pressure. They decided to postpone participation in public discussions and meetings, focusing on themselves. This gave them the space to heal their wounds and regain their strength. Vivian returned to her gardening, but now she was doing it not to escape from the world, but to find peace. She started writing a diary where she shared her thoughts and feelings. It helped her realize how important David was to her and how much she wanted to keep them connected. David, in turn, found solace in working on photographs. He started a new project in which he captured moments related to simple human emotions: joy, sadness, hope. This project became a way for him to express his feelings and understand what he was going through. After a few months, Vivian and David began to notice that their relationship was changing. They became closer than ever, because now their bond was based not only on love, but also on honesty, mutual support, and acceptance of each other. They realized that their struggle should not become their life. Instead, they decided that they would move forward, but do it together, regardless of what lies ahead. This step towards reconciliation has become an important stage for them. He showed them that even in the most difficult circumstances, you can find a way to yourself and to each other. They knew that their journey was not over yet, but now they had the confidence that they could overcome everything if they stuck together. The reconciliation between Vivian and David was the beginning of a new stage in their lives. They realized that their struggle for acceptance and mutual understanding is not the ultimate goal, but a process that requires constant attention and effort. After months of internal and external conflict, they realized that in order for their bond to remain strong, it was necessary not only to protect it, but also to fill it with meaning. They needed not just to cope with difficulties, but to learn to live anew with a clear understanding of their goals and desires. The first steps to a new life started small. Vivian and David decided to rebuild the house, which became for them a symbol of their struggle. This old house, full of memories and secrets, was for them a place where they could feel safe. They started with repairs. They cleaned the walls of mold, repainted the rooms, replaced old furniture. They spent every day at work, and this process brought them even closer together. Together, they chose colors for the walls, sorted through old things, added new details to the interior that reflected their personal tastes and shared dreams. The garden, which had previously been neglected and overgrown with grass, became for Vivian a project of her soul. She spent weeks cleaning the flower beds, planting new flowers and shrubs. There are places to relax in the garden, a wooden bench under an apple tree, a small fountain and paths made of stone. For her, the garden became a metaphor for their relationship. It required attention, patience, and love to blossom. Every evening, she watched the setting sun illuminate her blooming flower beds and felt that this garden had become a reflection of her inner world. David, in turn, found new inspiration in his work. After months of his career being undermined by rumors and condemnation, he decided to change direction. Instead of working for an architectural firm where he felt like an outsider, he started freelance projects that allowed him to work from home and spend more time doing what he loved. David began designing small apartment buildings for young families that could become cozy and affordable. His design was inspired by their own home. He sought to create a space that brings people together. But the most important step on the way to a new life was the decision to open your space to others. After much thought, they decided that their home would become not just their refuge, but also a place where people could feel free. They organized informal meetings where they discussed issues of acceptance, love, and support. These meetings started with small groups, but over time, their popularity has grown. People came from neighboring towns to share their stories, hear from others, and find support. At one of these meetings, a young couple appeared who were experiencing something similar to the story of Vivian and David. They felt isolated because of the condemnation of society, but Vivian and David's story gave them hope. The couple told how they had been afraid to talk about their feelings for a long time, but the example of Vivian and David inspired them to fight for their happiness. Such moments made Vivian and David feel that they had something to fight for. Over time, their home became a place where people came not only for support, but also for inspiration. Vivian started giving workshops on how to work with past traumas based on her experience. She studied psychology and self-help techniques to offer others practical tools. Her seminars attracted a variety of people, from those who faced condemnation to those who were just looking for a way to become happier. David found a way to express his story through art. He organized an exhibition of photographs that documented their journey from devastating moments to victories. The exhibition was called Communication and included not only their personal photographs, but also portraits of people they met on their way. The photographs showed different aspects of human life: love, struggle, acceptance. It attracted the attention of the local press and became one of the most discussed cultural events of the year. However, their new life was not without challenges. There were moments when old resentments and fears resurfaced. Some residents of the city still treated them with distrust, and their openness attracted the attention of those who were looking for an opportunity to condemn them again. But now, Vivian and David reacted differently. Instead of defending themselves or making excuses, they responded with self-confidence. They have learned not to let other people's words destroy their inner world. One of the most touching moments in their new life was the evening when they planted a new tree in their garden. It was the apple tree they had chosen together. For them, this tree has become a symbol of their new life, their connection and their strength. They planted it in the very center of the garden to remind them that even from the most difficult conditions, something beautiful can grow if you make an effort and give it a chance. The years they spent fighting for their happiness taught them the main thing. Life is not divided into black and white. It consists of complex shades, from which you need to choose those that make it brighter. Vivian and David realized that happiness is not a goal, but a process. It is a daily choice to love, forgive, accept yourself and others. Their path was not easy, but it made them stronger and helped them see beauty in every moment. Now their house, their garden, and their lives have become symbols of their victory. They were no longer hiding or afraid to be themselves. They lived the way they wanted and helped others find the courage to live the same way. Vivian and David started a new chapter where they not only fought, but also built, loved, and inspired. And this chapter was the beginning of real freedom for them. It's been a few years since Vivian and David started building their new lives. Their house became not just a place to live, but also a center where destinies were joined and new stories were born. People came to them not only for support, but also for inspiration. However, Vivian and David themselves still continued to find a balance between being open to others and protecting their own happiness. Over time, their house acquired a peculiar reputation. It was called the House of Hope. This name was fixed after they organized the first open-air festival. The festival was dedicated to the theme of love and acceptance, and it became a real event for their small town. People gathered in Vivian and David's garden to listen to music, read poetry, discuss books, and share their stories. This festival has become an annual event, attracting more and more participants and spectators. Over time, Vivian and David realized that their activities went beyond the local community. People from other cities and even countries began to write to them, telling them how their story inspired them to change. Among these letters, there were many stories about how other people found the courage to resist condemnation and fear. This pushed them to the idea of creating something bigger. Vivian suggested creating a foundation that would help people who find themselves in situations similar to their own. The foundation was supposed to provide support to those who faced condemnation, as well as educate society on tolerance and acceptance. The idea resonated with David, and soon they started working on this project. The foundation's creation turned out to be a difficult but inspiring process. They had to face bureaucracy, financial difficulties, and even attempts at sabotage by those who disapproved of their activities. But their perseverance and belief that they were doing the right thing helped overcome all obstacles. The foundation, which they called the Light of Communication, began its work 2 years after the first discussions. Its main purpose was to create a space for dialogue and provide assistance to those who felt isolated due to their choices or circumstances. The foundation also organized seminars, lectures, and creative meetings that helped people find their place in the world. Amid all this activity, Vivian and David began to think about starting their own family. For them, it was not only a matter of love, but also a symbol of their victory over prejudice and condemnation. They wanted their children to grow up in a world where they could be honest with themselves and others without fear of judgment. The adoption process turned out to be no less difficult than the creation of the foundation. They faced additional difficulties because of their past and public reputation. However, they were determined. After months of waiting and checking, they managed to adopt a 2-year-old girl named Clara. Clara became the center of a new life for them. She was inquisitive, active, and full of energy, which made them rethink their priorities. Taking care of the child reminded them that life consists not only of struggle, but also of small joys, walking in the garden, reading books together, playing on the floor. Clara helped them see the world through different eyes, through the eyes of a child who does not know what prejudice and condemnation are. Despite the joy of Clara's arrival, life didn't get any easier. The foundation required a lot of time and effort, and their personal lives were still under the scrutiny of society. There were days when Vivian felt on the verge of burnout. There were moments when David wondered if they could handle it all. One of these moments was the scandal that broke out due to a publication in a local newspaper. The article claimed that their foundation promotes immoral values and destroys traditional society. This article caused a storm of discussion. Many began to demand the closure of the fund. It was a difficult time when they felt that all their work could be ruined. But instead of giving up, Vivian and David decided to respond to the criticism with their own actions. They organized an open event where they talked about their activities and showed the results of their work. The event was attended by people whom the foundation helped to change their lives. These stories touched the hearts of many, and eventually they were able to restore their reputation. Years later, their efforts began to bear fruit. The Svet's Fayaz Foundation has become known at the national level. His activities attracted media attention, and Vivian and David began to be invited to conferences and seminars where they talked about their path and shared their experiences. Their story has become an example of how love and faith in their principles can overcome any obstacle. Their garden, which they once restored with their own hands, has now become a symbol of hope. Every spring it bloomed with bright colors, reminding that even after the harshest winters, nature finds a way to return to life. When Clara grew up, she began to understand what her parents had been through. These stories inspired her on her own path. Growing up, she decided to continue the business started by Vivian and David. She became a human rights activist and brought a fresh perspective to the foundation's work. Vivian and David have lived a long and eventful life. Not only did they create a family and help a lot of people, but they also left a legacy that inspired others. Their story has shown that even the most difficult circumstances can be overcome if you believe in your feelings and are not afraid to go against the flow. At the end of their days, they sat on the veranda of their house, looking at the garden, which has now become a real paradise. Vivian held David's hand, and in her eyes shone the same confidence that had helped them through all the difficulties. They knew that their path was not easy, but it was real, and this was their main victory.